So next on our agenda is a special presentation regarding our city water infrastructure and our water supply discussion. And I know we have some people here that are interested in this subject, and we have special people with us this evening that will be doing the presentation, I believe, Allison Fauski and Greg Johnson.
Yep, and Mayor, I'm going to start this. This is going to be kind of a tag team approach. So I'm going to start out with just giving, for the benefit of not only our residents but our council, of kind of where we've been with water infrastructure and water treatment here in the city of Minnetrista. Then we're going to transition to a PowerPoint presentation by Allison and Greg. They're going to talk a little bit kind of about where we're going and what's required to get to where we want to go. And then we're going to hopefully pose a few questions to the council about next steps for us. And it's probably going to involve some educational things for our residents. So just to give you a start here, let me see, here we go. So the timeline will be including kind of the major mileposts from 2011 up to the current date of 2021. I've omitted a bunch of stuff in here, and it's not that it's not important, but it's just not the major mileposts, you know. Things that we, dollar amounts that we spent to buy land for where the water treatment plants are and that kind of stuff, feasibility studies. I kind of passed over all that. We did an update to the comprehensive water plan back in July of 2011, so virtually 10 years ago. And at that council meeting in July, I just did a screen grab of one of the maps on there. It shows a couple of things. It shows a water treatment plant, a well, and a water tower in the southwest part of Minnetrista, not actually too far from where we ended up. And it also shows a future water treatment plant on Kings Point Road, which eventually did get built. Let me get this up here.
Will you be coming back to that?
I can, but we'll see. We just started.
Is there a connection between that proposed tower for St. Bonnie and the one that's on Kings Point?
This is not about St. Bonnie's water tower.
No, there's no.
This is the city of Minnetrista's proposed water plan update back in 2011. It did show that we were,
I'm not trying to.
yeah, no, but I'm just saying that was our plan all along, to build the stuff that you see going in down there right now. And we did talk to St. Bonnie at a certain point in time, and they were not interested in working together on water structure, so infrastructure.
Well, I'm on the city side. I knew some kind of connection between the St. Bonnie water tower and the city.
Let's go through the
Yeah.
the presentation.
That's okay.
And
I
then,
understand.
yeah, yeah. and
It
then we'll-
it may become a little clearer as we move forward.
Yeah.
And if you still have the question, let us know. So in June of 2013, the council heard from WSB engineers at the time that they did a presentation on the water treatment facility feasibility study, and the council directed staff to go forward with a pilot study and costs and a rate structure to determine how to pay for those future costs, which would be the infrastructure. In July of 2013, the council authorized the study, discussed at the June meeting, and asked the engineers to develop some alternatives to meet the projected 2030 water system demands, and it was determined at that time that a standalone north system and a connected south and central system would be the best course of action, which is in fact what we did. There were a few twists and turns, as you'll see. 2013, the north system, it was determined by the engineers that there was sufficient existing capacity and storage, and it could support itself. Whereas in the south and central system, there was a need for some additional capacity and storage overall, mostly due to firefighting. And then the two systems, that's where we got most of our complaints on the drinking water quality. On December of 2013, they accepted the pilot study and authorized WSB to design two gravity filtration plants, the north system and the south water system being a water plant being a little larger. And then in February of 2014, unbeknownst to our city staff and a few members of the city council, one council member working alone brought forth what was called a value engineering study from a completely different engineering firm, Bolton and Mink. They suspended the contract for final design for WSB, and then the value engineering timeline was created with Bolton and Mink. And I'm purposely on not delving into the politics related to that, but that's actually what did happen. So there was a value engineering study in March or February of 2014, and then in March they presented a preliminary plan of a value engineering study to the council. And the council at that point decided that they wanted to explore a reverse osmosis plant for a centralized, which means one plant only. And it actually is going to be down the road from here at City Hall. And then at that point, WSB kind of removed themselves from our process, since they're our city engineer and still are, and they were tasked with the design and implementation of the water infrastructure, but like I said, a council member overruled that. We had an election in November. The council during November also received an update from Bolton and Bank, and they were now reporting a $19.5 to $21.5 million centralized water treatment plant to be located east of the public safety facility here. But after the election and the election of Mayor Whalen and 2 other council members, the council stopped the project because of the escalating costs, and I'll have something at the end about the costs. So in January, with a new council seated, they began re-examining the issue once again. And so the council decided to move forward with a RFP for, and you'll see in a second, to go after and deal with the city's water system improvements that needed to be done. And we started our search for a water tower site, which is important to note. So there were 8 firms that were solicited, 6 submitted bids or RFPs for the following projects. SEH was chosen. They're still in the process of finishing up with them. This is 6 years ago. They did the South Central water main connection to help design the water treatment plants, both the north and south, and then the current and final piece of the puzzle is the southwest area water tower that's going to be online here in fourth quarter. So in July of 16, the south and central water main was connected, and the cost was about $3 million, which included all the right-of-way purchasing, which was minimal since they were decentralized plants, not a centralized plant. On both December of 16 and Feb of 17, the 2 water plants came on first. North plant came on in December and the south plant in Feb. The total cost was about $9 million for the 2 plants, and those again were gravity filtration plants, not reverse osmosis. And we did have a delay in trying to find a suitable location for a water tower. That was difficult to do. David Abel could tell you more details about that, but in general, we explored many different sites. One was the Moss property. We wanted to buy an acre there. It was listed at $400,000 for that 1 acre. The Turk property was in what was called Ag Preserve, and it wasn't going to be available. This is back in 2017. So this is 5-6 years later. It wasn't going to be available for that long of a period. So that got ruled out. There's an outlot in Hunter's Crest. There was a 2.76 acre site that did not work out. Hunter's Pass, there was a property owned by the Klinkner family. They would not discuss selling a piece of their property with us. Lyle Park was kind of our fallback position since we were getting frustrated to try to find a location. That's a 15.5 acre park. We really didn't want to use it, but that was a place where we were, if we couldn't find a spot, that's where we were going to put it. We actually had a bid-in purchase agreement with Commerce Bank, who owned an outlot called Outlot D. And because of some legal issues with the covenants and the Hunter's Crest HOA, and also some intense resident objection to having to live near a water tower, that purchase got derailed and we did not go through with it. We finally did purchase a tract of land at 9400 Highway 7. We bought a 2 acre site and it cost us about $100,000. At that point, we began in the construction of the water tower. One of the most important things about building a water tower is painting it, and depending on when you start, you may or may not be able to avoid or not avoid the winter break. We were not able to. So it was a 27 total months. It's actually 20 months of construction, and we had to sit out 7 months from November of last year to May of this year, where you can't do anything for painting, et cetera. So that water tower will go online at the end of October, and it'll cost about $2.5 million. This is just kind of a graphic. You can see there's that's proposed site 1B. They're right next to 1, and then you've got that site 3, site 4, site 5, There was a whole bunch of sites that we looked at. That's actually an aerial view of the current site. These were the costs that the engineers provided back in the day. Site 1B is the one that got selected. As you can see, it was one of the two shorter water main connection lengths. That's in the second column there, only 1,100 feet, and that's important because there's a lot of cost to connecting the water tower with the water main. And it was also only 156 feet high. The shortest connection was 500 feet, but the tower, based on the topography of the land, had to be 192 foot high. So it was actually the least expensive option, which is why we built and bought that 2-acre site. And this is just some options. And the most important things are the land availability and proximity to the 12-inch trunk main. And you can see the X's on those two ones that were the two lowest cost ones. This is just a couple of pictures of, 3 pictures of it approaching from the west, directly dead on, and then from the east of where the water tower site is now being, water tower is now being constructed. This is a look as of about a week or so ago. The left picture, you can see the cone, the top is being built on the ground, and that'll be raised up here sometime in August and put on top of the tower. So I did talk about cost a little earlier. The original plan before 2015, which is when the new council was seated, was a centralized water treatment plant. That was 19.5 and growing to 21.5. We didn't really know the unknown cost of the right-of-way acquisition, but it was going to be quite expensive because you'd have to buy right-of-way between a lot of different parcels to get all this stuff down to one location, whereas we're using 2 locations. That was a $24 million and growing price tag, and the current plan at $14.5 million. Again, the water tower is going to be built on both plans, but in general, it was the cost of building the plants. So council's made the right decision. That was our original intention back in 2011, which is where I started this PowerPoint of what we were wanting to do. And again, like I said, there was a few other people that wanted to do something different for a while, and we had to basically it just came out that it wasn't the right thing to do financially. So that's what I have as far as a PowerPoint goes, to just give a quick historical background of our water infrastructure. And at this point in time, I'm going to ask Allison, and Greg eventually is going to jump in here and talk a little bit about kind of the water supply and treatment and where we're going. So you kind of know where we've been and where we're at today, and now where we're going is kind of the next steps. Allison?
Thank you, Mike. Madam Mayor, members of the council. This evening we have Greg Johnson. He's the director of our water wastewater group. And I asked Greg to attend this evening. He and I both felt it was really important to have his expertise at the meeting this evening. I can provide an overview of how the city plans for water infrastructure, so kind of the process to go through and look at where we're at with our water supply. But you know, Greg's really the expert in this, and so he's available. He'll be presenting part of this this evening to give the council a background on where we're at with some of our projections. So moving forward, I just wanted to give an overview of what this presentation will cover. So we'll take a look at what we're looking at for the south system and what the city has as far as water plans. There are a couple documents that we reference on a regular basis when it comes to infrastructure planning. We'll take a look at some of our recent water usages, and then as well as the restrictions that have been implemented this summer here this year. And we'll talk a little bit about the impact of weather. And then Greg will take over looking at supply and infrastructure trigger charts. So taking a look at what the consumption has been to date and what the projections are looking forward in the next few years as far as infrastructure needs in the city. And then we'll move on to look at some options to meet the demand of the water, the process to increase the output or to increase the amount of water into the water system to the residents of Minnetrista. And we'll talk a little bit about messaging and public education to the residents of Minnetrista. So this is the south system. You can see it generally lies the north and south Saunders areas where well 5 is at the top of the slide there. That well came in service in '99. Once the south tower and water treatment plant came online, that well has only been used as a backup, and that's typical in a city. So we have both well 4 and 5 as backup wells. And the reason that they're backup is due to aesthetic issues. So they're higher in iron and manganese. And so while they're safe to drink, any color in the water, any odor, any taste is not palatable to a lot of residents. And so the city identifies that, yes, that's not palatable, so we'll use those as a backup in an emergency. Again, the challenge being is that when those don't go through the water treatment plant, they're not treated for that iron and manganese, it generates a lot of calls from residents, and so there's a balance with that. We also have well 3 within that system. That's off County Road 44. As Mr. Barone pointed out, we have the new water tower under construction, and then the Kings Point Road water tower and wells 6 and 7 at the water treatment plant site off Kings Point Road. So when
Just a quick question. Is this new tower a part of the system or not?
Yes.
And it's in St. Bonnie, right?
No,
Nope.
it's in Minnetrista. It's in Minnetrista, yeah.
I'm
Can
seeing
you-
St. Bonnie there and I'm wondering.
Yeah, Minnetrista surrounds St. Bonnie.
Yeah.
So you have to go through St. Bonnie before you get to the water tower.
Given to understand earlier that that wasn't going to be a part of the system.
No, it is, yeah.
So when we look at the planning documents that the city has in place with regards to water infrastructure, there are two components to that. One is the comprehensive plan, which was recently updated. And then we also have a water supply plan. And both those documents, they look at the city's growth, so where the population is at the time, and the projected growth, both with city staff and Met Council. And we use those we look at that information to go and make some projections on what type of improvements will be necessary and when. So we look at, for example, an average daily demand. So, typical of what I was thinking about this earlier today, I'm like, when you think of your electricity use in the winter is a lot lower than it is in the summer because you don't have your air conditioner running. So likewise with a water supply system, you have your average demand, which is what you would use for showering, washing, etc. But then you have a peak demand that comes up in the summertime, and that's when we have irrigation. And so when we look at average versus peak, you have a multiplier from your average to get to your peak, so that we can plan the water system. So as I mentioned previously, in the comprehensive plan and the water supply plan, we were looking at the use of wells 4 and 5 to help during those peak periods when you have a lot of people irrigating, it's hot. However, with the dissatisfaction of that water quality, there's a lot of challenges in bringing those wells online. In fact, I didn't bring it in here, but I had one of our public works employees today bring me a sample it was actually from well 3, which is the better well of 3, 4, and 5, and it was cloudy. And again, it's safe, but it's a palate issue with the consumer of the water. So when we look at the difference between an average day and a peak day, in Minnetrista, we were seeing this year a 3.3 multiplier. So our peak, we were seeing 3.3 times the demand than for water in the spring than you did in the winter. When we look at our water supply plan, which goes through the Department of Natural Resources, the DNR's threshold says that you should be around 2.6 for a multiplier. So we're seeing a higher than anticipated, per the DNR, irrigation demand on the city of Minnetrista system. So we look at those plans about every 10 years just to make sure that our projections are accurate and make adjustments as necessary. So the next couple slides here I thought were interesting to show to the council and to the residents on how we got to restricting outside irrigation. So this graphic is from the city's data system that tracks the water tower elevations. So on the left-hand side, you see the water tower the elevation of the water within the tower. So it tops out at 40, just below 40 feet, all the way down to 0. Now there are a couple of lines, and I apologize, the yellow one is very difficult to read, but there are 2 lines that were drawn in here for very good reason. One is the yellow line at 21 feet, and that is our tower level for fire protection. So when we work through our water infrastructure, we want to make sure that there's enough reserve water in that tower in the event of a fire, that firefighters can hook onto the hydrant and have water to fight the fire. So that's a key elevation. And then as well is the red line, which is at 10 feet. And the reason that's an important an important level to distinguish is that's when there's a boil water order. And what happens is when the water level gets to 10 feet, the pressure in the system, in the pipes that are underground, is too low to keep that water moving. And so that's when bacteria, it stagnates and bacteria can grow, and then you have to issue a boil water order so that people can boil the water in order for it to be safe to consume. So we certainly don't want that. And as you can see from the beginning of June, as we move from left to right on the screen, we saw some very hot temperatures in June, no precipitation, and we saw that water tower level dip down below that 21-foot threshold on the 4th, and then on the 8th, the elevation got to 13.1, and when we start seeing those 3 dips down below that fire protection threshold, that was when the first restriction went on so that we could maintain fire protection.
Which tower is that?
That is from the Kings Point Tower. So Kings Point is the only tower that serves that south system currently.
And just for clarification, the south system also serves our central district.
Mm-hmm.
They're connected, so South Saunders area, North Saunders
Yes.
area, the Pinnacle Way, those are all connected to this system as well. Just
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So this one, this is what happens when I didn't get a chance to look at it on the screen here. But this graphic, again, it shows that threshold at 21 feet and 10 feet once we got the revised watering schedule in place. So the revised schedule, instead of allowing irrigation every other day, allowed each resident on the city system to irrigate 2 days a week. And what we saw is, again, we saw the water tower elevations dropping below that 21-foot threshold. And then on the June 24th, on the right-hand side of the screen, we saw it drop to 10.8 feet. And that's when the restriction went back on again based on what we were seeing for the demand on these towers. So the first day that this, I can remember on the 16th, the first day that the watering restrictions, the modified schedule was released, Superintendent Peters texted me and told me what the tower elevation was only 7 hours after the restriction was lifted, and it had dropped significantly. I mean, the people, and understandably, people were ready to start irrigating, but it dropped that tower elevation very significantly on the first day, and we weren't really seeing it recover as this graphic shows. So we are in a drought. This information was the latest that I found last week when I was putting the presentation together. It was, the map was based on data from the 13th. I am not a meteorologist, but I can only guess that the drought conditions have expanded since we haven't seen any significant rain. But you'll see Hennepin County there in green. So based on this data, we are in what is classified as a moderate drought, with the severe drought in the darker orange starting to move into the northern part of Hennepin County. So we're seeing some weather system that, quite simply, our water system isn't designed for drought conditions, where we look at some averages, which most systems are. So when we look at that relationship between rainfall and water demands, we pulled this data based on actual city data. So the top line there is the city's water demand, and the bottom line is the rainfall. So over the past 4 years there, we've plotted, or pardon me, we have 5 data points on there. You can see as the amount of rainfall, the average rainfall decreased from 2016 to 2020, we saw the water demand increase, which again, you would expect to see in the drier conditions more demand on your water system. So with this, I'll turn it over to Greg. He'll go through some of the trigger charts and looking at our distribution system.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the council. Greg Johnson with WSB. The next few slides, I'm going to talk about the planning component for a water system and what we look at when we're sizing water systems. And when we're sizing a system, it's commonly to use what's called the trigger chart, which is this graph up here. And it's a good way to illustrate your historical and projected water demands with respect to the capacity of your system. And so if you look at this graph here, the kind of lower black horizontal line, that's your treatment capacity for the south system. So that's right about just a little under 1.5 million gallons per day. And then if you look at the green line above, that's your water supply capacity. So you can see the supply capacity is significantly higher than the treatment capacity. And that's mainly because wells 3, 4, and 5 pump directly into the distribution system. And they're only used as backup wells. So those wells are not being treated at this time. So when you're sizing a system, it's important that you're, both the green line, which is your supply, and your black line, the treatment, is actually above your demands. In that previous slide that Allison was showing, you can see how, because of the drought conditions, the last few years we haven't had a lot of rainfall. So if you look at those little yellow circles down there, you can see they've increased over time. If you look at the straight line projection, there's a little line. When it gets to the point where that little slanted line on the lower left-hand corner crosses the black line, that's when you're exceeding your treatment capacity.
Can I just interject just for a moment? I think it's important to distinguish what we mean by treatment. So the well water in Minnetrista, it can be treated at the well house. What Greg's referring to as far as treatment means water going through the water treatment plant. So it's treated for the iron and manganese, et cetera. So just for those that may be in the audience or watching, the water is safe to drink. It's treated, it's just not through the treatment plant.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And yeah, so when we're treating water, it's more to improve the aesthetics of the water. So we're taking out the iron, which makes your plumbing fixtures brown. We're taking out the manganese. That's what makes your fixtures black, stains your laundry. Those are the contaminants we're treating, but there's nothing health-wise that we're concerned about. Okay, next slide, please. So if you take the same chart and you compare it to the city's comprehensive plan, if you look at that kind of slotted long right line, kind of at an angle on the bottom there, you can see those are the projections that came out of the comp plan. So you can see those are lower. So what that's telling us is that because of the lack of rainfall we've had in recent years, these projections are shooting up at a faster rate. Now, unfortunately, we can't predict what the next number of years are going to be for rainfall. Nobody can really predict that. But however, if we continue on that same trend that we're showing on the lower left-hand corner there, we're going to exceed our capacity, or probably within the next couple of years. So there are options to meet your water demands. The first one is to increase your treatment capacity. That's either expanding existing treatment or building separate water plants to maybe treat some of the local well or remote wells. The other thing is increasing your supply capacity. But one thing to keep in mind is when you're increasing supply capacity, you're always trying to achieve optimal water quality too. So sometimes expanding treatment and capacity go hand in hand. And then the last important part of this is the messaging towards the public, and it gets on to education and water conservation. How do we do more efficient water irrigation? How do we water at the right times of the day to try to use less water? So one thing that we would recommend the council doing is doing a further analysis of expanding treatment. And the first one we look at expanding your salt water plant that you just built. See if it's possible to expand that with additional capacity. The other option is to look at constructing a water treatment plant near the existing untreated wells. So those are wells 3, 4, and 5. And then the last one is constructing a new water plant near future wells, so that if, ideally you want to have the wells as close to the treatment plant as possible, so then you can, it requires less piping in between those two facilities.
I think that's why we drilled the 2 new wells by the treatment plants on Kings Point Road. Yeah,
Yeah,
the well 5 and 6.
well
yeah.
6 and 7.
6 and 7, yeah.
So when you're planning for a well, there is a process you have to go through, and we actually went through it, remember, back when we were involved in the design of 6 and 7. And the first thing you have to do is you have to construct a test well, so you can determine what the pumping capacity is in that location, and determine the water quality. Is it going to require treatment or not? And then the next thing, which is becoming more of a challenge today, is getting an appropriation permit from the DNR. And then the last thing, it has to go through the plan review for the Minnesota Department of Health. So if you look at that typical timeline, it's usually about 12 to 18 months just to implement a well.
I'll pop back in here unless there's any questions that.
I just have one question. So he said well 3, 4, and 5, and you just said 4 and 5.
So 4 and 5, thank you for asking that question. So 4 and 5 are the 2 wells that there are issues with the iron and manganese, and staff prefers not to use those as backup. But the well 3 is used to supplement the water treatment plant capacity.
Yeah, and one thing is those 3 wells are actually, all 3 of them are drilled into different formations. So like well 5 is really a shallow glacial drift well. And then 3 is a Tunnel City Wanawak well, that's the same as 6 and 7. And then well 4 is actually a Mount Simon well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually
That's the deepest,
That's
I
the
think.
deepest formation in the Twin Cities.
Yeah.
And challenge with that well is it does have restrictions as far as how much water you can pump out of it. And typically, it contains natural radium. So then you're possibly treating another contaminant.
The things you get to learn when you're on council, interesting. So one of the components when we look at increased water supply, Greg had mentioned this, is you have to get an appropriation permit from the DNR. And I pulled this from the statute in that before even applying for a permit to get a new well, the communities are required to demonstrate that we've encouraged water conservation and water use demand reduction, so that we've employed some public education components to reduce that demand on the system, so that we're not just asking for more water. We've done our best to educate folks on being good stewards of the treated water that we have already permits for. So when we look at public education, there are a few components that we have to draw from. One is to provide some information on water saving tips, and I know Ms. Polfus has been sharing some of that information through the city's social media and the website. Another component is looking at established lawns, depending on the source, between 1 and 1.5 inches of water per week. How do you measure what your system's putting out? So it's getting that message out there that you're I don't know what point it changes, but let's say your 5-year-old lawn does not need the same amount of water as your fresh sod does. So making sure that you get those things, your irrigation system reprogrammed. So when we look at an example, over in Woodland Cove, I just kind of took a look and said, well, it looks like most properties are somewhere around 70 feet wide and 120 feet deep. And if you irrigate half that property, because the other half is house landscaping, hard landscaping driveway, if you irrigated 1 inch per week, you would use about 10,000 gallons per month. So that's, we kind of use that as a baseline.
But that includes your household water as well.
That's just irrigation.
Oh, just irrigation,
Mhm.
okay.
Yep. Again, that's an average, but we just wanted to give council kind of an idea of how much water goes onto the lawn based on that 1 inch guideline. So we also take a look at, as I mentioned earlier, that multiplier. If we're seeing properties within the city of Minnetrista where their summer water usage is over 2.5 or 2.6 times their winter one, well, you know, maybe they're over irrigating. And what can we do? How can we convey that message if we can target some of those properties and say, hey, you know, give them the information, give them, you know, understand where this information is coming from, what's the genesis of sharing this information, and why we're asking people to take a look at some of their water use. So another component to look at with regards to trying to reduce the usage of your average customer is to look at your utility rates. So currently the city has a tiered rate structure, as I believe all cities in the metro do, that are on that have a water distribution. So the idea is that the users within that lower tier pay a lower rate per 1,000 gallons, and then you move up through there. So included in this example is the cost for your higher end user for each of the tier, just so that the council can kind of see financially what's the impact when you move from one tier to another. So likewise from the residential system, on the next slide, there's the tiered water system for commercial. You'll see the usage rate for commercial is higher per 1,000 gallons than it is for residential, and the tiers are at different cutoff quantities as well. And so there again, there's some examples showing what that user would see for a utility bill if they were on the higher end of each of those tiers. And then lastly, there's the school rate system. So you'll see this, it's bumped down lower, and what the bill would be based on what tier they're in. So if the usage rate per 1,000 gallons, that third column from the left, if the council wanted to take a look at, is that an appropriate rate? Staff would recommend doing a utility rate study to see how the city compares to others. Is this an appropriate rate for what your system's at? Is there an appetite to change those rates? That's another option that the council could look at in addition to some of the public education components that we've spoken about. And I think Mr. Barone had some additional
I do.
comments.
So with this all happening with a very hot June that we had this year, I think we had 13 or 14 days over 90 and 2 inches of rain the whole month. What I did was ask Dawn, who handles all our utility billing, to give me a spreadsheet. Now the spreadsheet
Can you make it a
had,
little bit larger?
yeah.
Thank you.
So let me walk people through this. So this is city water only, not people that are on wells. So there are total residential properties, there's 1,700 of them. And of those 1,700, if you work your way down, there's the peaking factor, as Allison spoke about in her presentation. There was the 2.6, that's the DNR level, and the 3.3 is our average, which is high. But of the 1,700 something, we've got 400, or about a fourth of our total properties that are already using 3.3 or more peaking factor or times their winter allowance. And then under 3.3 is 3/4 of them. And then I further broke down so work your way down the column to the green and yellow box. The breakdown of the 3.3, there's 1,300. 257 are between 2.6 and 3, and then 2.6 or less is 60. There's 1,000 something. So if you look at that orange box, that adds the 416 there in the blue box, 416, and it adds the 257 that are between 2.6 and 3.3. That's about 39% of all our residential properties are using more than the 2.6 factor, peaking factor. That's a lot of people using a lot of water.
Are those larger lots by any chance?
That's just all properties on city water. It doesn't have anything to do with the size of the lot.
They're going to vary.
It's gonna
The lots
vary.
are going to vary, yeah.
And so on the two right columns, you have the north system and the south system. As you can see, and as I think I've mentioned to previous councils, that we're seeing all our growth in the south system. 19 of every 20, or 95% of all new homes built are connecting to the south system. And you can see as far as just the over 3.3, it's about a 4-to-1 ratio, 81 to 19 of over that. And then for the 2.6, it's about that 3-to-1, that 75 to 25 ratio. So if you want to go to the next slide, Ally. There's one more if you click down. Nope, just, yeah, I guess you could scroll down, but there you go. You might have to shorten that up. So I added an additional column. And on the right means, if you saw the tiered water structure, 0 to 25, 25 to 50, and over 50. So these are people or properties that are using over 50,000 gallons just in quarter two. And so there's 248. 2/3 of them are using over 3.3, and the rest are under that. So basically what we're saying is it doesn't really matter how big your property is or small your property is. We're getting in all shapes and sizes and all levels, but there's properties there that are using a lot of water, and they're exceeding by far the peaking factors that are built in by the DNR and what our current average is. So our goal, as Ms. Falsky mentioned, is to do some education. So one of the things we'd like to do, not bore them with a bunch of graphs, but just to tell them that we need to see what we can do about conserving water. And I think people feel like it's an unlimited resource, and it's not. And we're seeing that in some of those trigger charts that show the increase, the steady uprise in usage. You're seeing it with the other information that was presented a little earlier. And what's going on is that we would like to identify all residents and give them some information, but we'd really like to target some of the people that seem to be using a lot of water and say, you probably don't have to. As Ms. Falsky had in that one slide, if you have kind of a normal lot in Hunter's Crest or Turtle Creek, you can probably get by with, 10,000 gallons in a month. So in a quarter, we bill quarterly, that's gonna be 30,000 gallons. That puts you in that middle tier, plus your other home usage. So this is second quarter. Third quarter is usually the hottest. You have July, August, and September. July and August are generally hotter than June. Now, we had a really hot June, which is why we have this water ban. But as you can see, based on going back to where we've been with water structure and where we're going, what we need to do, I think the most important thing is to try to educate our public about trying to conserve water, not spread so much on their lawns.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do is I just want to make a couple of clarifications, and then I'll open it up for questions by the council and maybe a few people out there. So in answer to your question, I think it was a little confusing. One, St. Bonifacius is a separate city, and they have their own water tower and their own water system within their city boundaries. What we were talking about, and this was a little confusing, we have a new water tower, but you have to go through St. Bonnie because we completely surround St. Bonnie. So you have to go through St. Bonnie, and the new water tower is there. That new one that is under construction is connected to the Kings Point water tower and that treatment plant. So it was a little confusing, I think. The other thing I want to clarify, currently we have a DNR allocation, and that's an allocation based on the number of residents or water users that are on our system. And when we go over that allocation, there are some things that happen. What happens? Do we pay penalties? Do we pay fines? What happens when we go over that allocation?
Madam Mayor, that's a great question. I'm going to ask Greg if he can provide some clarification on that.
Sure. Madam Mayor, there are penalties when you exceed your corporation permit, and it is dependent on your population and how much you exceed too. So that rate can vary. I can't tell you exactly what it is for Minnetrista at this time, but there are penalties assessed.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make that clear because I think a lot of people or some people in our city think, oh, well, if I pay for the water, I should be able to just pump as much as I want or use as much as I want, whereas we as a city cannot just keep pumping as much as we want, because we're allocated a certain number of gallons every year, and when we exceed it, we have to pay extra, and there's some serious fines. But also, as Ms. Fauski pointed out, if we want to, and we will need to, dig a new well, drill a new well, then we have to go through certain steps, and they look at our current usage as well. So for all those reasons, it's important to try and conserve and stay within our allocations. So